We'll go ahead and get started. We're at the top of the hour and we are excited for our lunchtime keynote. I hope y'all have all been able to grab some lunch. We've got Dr. Bonni who will talk about productivity during challenging times. Bonni is a host and producer for the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, as well as the Dean of Teaching and Learning at Vanguard University. And then the session will be moderated by Dr. Deborah Fowler, who's our director for the Center of Teaching Excellence at Texas A&M University. In terms of just a quick bio on Bonni, and this is the short version, Bonni gets the privilege of speaking with exceptional educators as the host of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast. Since 2014, her podcast has provided a space to explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. In addition to her role as the Dean of Teaching and Learning at Vanguard University, Bonni is also an associate professor of business and management, and teaching and learning are vital to her sense of purpose in life. Bonni has prepared a resource page, which is linked in our Canvas Big Splash shell under her session, so I'd encourage you to reference that. That'll be available certainly after we wrap up the Big Splash next week. And in terms of logistics for the session, Bonni will present and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the session that Deborah will lead us through. The session is being recorded and then we will post a link to the recording on the Office for Academic Innovation YouTube channel in the coming week. If you'd like to join the conversation, we have a Twitter hashtag, #TAMU_BigSplash, and then you can also email your questions, which you all have done a fantastic job of doing all day, to academicinnovation@TAMU.EDU. And if we don't get to your questions today, we'll be sure to get back with you soon. So with that, Bonni, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And Deborah, I'm looking forward to our conversation about the questions in a little while. For now, I want to start out by just thanking you for having me at today's event and for taking the time out of your lunchtime to join me. I've been interested in the subject of productivity for a long time. I can remember being early in my career and having questions at the time about how to navigate all of the differing priorities, and life has certainly got a lot more complicated since then. As was mentioned by Jocelyn, I carry a number of roles, and I know you do too. And in fact, before we even really dive in too much to talking about what productivity looks like in challenging times, I'd like you to reflect for just a minute or two about the roles that you play in your life. You may have a role like I do of being a faculty member. You may have a role of being a caregiver. You may have a role of some form of leadership, volunteerism, what have you. I'd like you to think about those roles and maybe identify 3 to 5 of them now. You can jot them down if you've got a piece of paper next to you, or if you're sitting in front of a computer, you're welcome to type them in, but just be thinking about the different roles that you play. The title of today's presentation is Productivity in Challenging Times. I'm not sure I would have accepted the invitation to come and talk just about productivity, because this is certainly a wild time to be thinking about productivity in our lives. And so a lot of what I have to share today isn't necessarily productivity for productivity's sake or productivity according to other people's metrics, but it really does come back to those roles. What are the ways in which we're able to show up in our lives to feel like we have some sense of meaning and significance in our lives? And we can oftentimes feel them sort of pulling at one another, and especially in the pandemic that we're all living through now. So hopefully you have your list of the roles that you play. I'd like to share some of the roles that I play as well, just to give you a little bit of a sense, and Jocelyn mentioned them as well. So I am a dean at a relatively small institution. That means that I work with the groups that are responsible for leading our library, for our student success initiatives, such as student retention, our disability services, our tutoring, our supplemental instruction, and an area very near and dear to my heart is our faculty development efforts as well. I'm also a podcaster. I've been podcasting since June of 2014, and there's a lot that I can say in terms of the pandemic that I have failed at when it comes to productivity. I'll share a little bit of that in a while, but one thing I'm really proud of since June of 2014 is that every single week there has been an episode that has aired of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast. I have the great honor of being able to speak with these incredible educators from all over the world in all different types of institutions and disciplines. I'm inspired by them on a weekly basis, and I'm so excited that I get to share them with you as well. If you enjoy listening to podcasts, it's one that is a source of inspiration for me, and I hope would be for you as well. And then finally, I'm also a professor. So one of the things that's been important to me as I have taken on leadership roles at my institution, I've never stopped teaching, because that is representative to me of the people that we serve. And I never want to get too far away from that, and make sure that I'm staying up and staying close to the things that brings me the greatest significance for being in higher education. So I mentioned to you that this has been difficult. It's been difficult for me. I know it's been difficult for you, and it's kind of hard sometimes to talk about something like productivity and to share some of the approaches, because I don't want it to seem easy. I have heard from many people during the pandemic who are suffering due to depression, due to anxiety. I have heard from a number of people who have ADHD and the ways in which the pandemic has affected them. So I hope that today, as you listen, you think about the overarching premise that I have. It is not about getting all these things I'm about to share with you right. There is no perfect score on this stuff. I'd suggest that you think about the roles that I asked you to identify early on. What are the roles that you play? And just one or two things you might do differently to help you be able to show up and be a little bit more fully present in even just one of those roles in your life. I mentioned the roles. How could I mention them without talking about I am also a spouse, and I am a mother of two. I have a daughter who is 6 and a son who is 8. And my husband and I had never intended on being homeschoolers. So we've definitely had to navigate some of the complexities of both of us working full time and trying to navigate those roles. And then also really trying to help our kids in terms of their own educational experiences and just their lives. So it has been a lot to juggle. I only share this because I just empathize with you, because I suspect you're here today because you have a lot that you have to try to navigate and juggle as well. And I wanted to mention that I wrote a book called The Productive Online and Offline Professor. It is linked to in that resources page. And the things that I'm going to talk about today are shared in that book. And if you'd like to check it out, it's probably at your library. You could check out your library, or if you'd like to purchase it, the links are on my website, which I'll share with you in just a little bit of a moment. But I did want to also confess that just because I wrote a book on productivity doesn't mean that I don't fail at these things. In fact, I very much do. This is an actual photograph from our actual laundry room. And one of the challenges we've been facing as parents is not just storing our clothes in the laundry room and just having the kids like come and pick out their daily clothes. Things have definitely gotten chaotic. This is not even the worst picture of the laundry room, by the way. We have had upwards of 7 and 8 clean loads of laundry just sitting there waiting for someone to fold them and put them away. So that's a silly metaphor. Perhaps it's silly until you don't have anything to wear for the day, or your children don't. But I know that for so many of you, it has been really challenging for you. And I hope we can just enter into today's conversation with just a few approaches that might make things a little bit easier. So as Jocelyn mentioned, this is the resources page that's going to be available to you. In fact, it already is. You can get it through the Canvas shell. And down at the bottom, if you just want to bypass that, you can go to teachinginhighered.com/Canvas. TAMU 2020. So feel free to access it there. It's got a lot of the books that I have read that have meant a lot to me in terms of productivity, articles, podcast episodes. And then along the right-hand side are some of the specific approaches and resources that I mentioned for each of the pieces of advice that I'll be sharing. And just as a preview, here are the 5 things that we're going to talk about that we can do to allow ourselves to show up, be a little bit more present, and have some of this be more manageable. First thing we'll look at is using our brains, and specifically using our brains for what they're best at, and not trying to get our brains to do things that they're not very good at. Second, we'll talk about some specific tools that we can use, and how do we use those tools for what they were designed to do, instead of trying to sort of bend them to our will to get them to do tasks and serve purposes for us that they were never intended to do. Third up, we're going to talk about putting things where they go, having a place for things, and that includes digital things. We're going to look at the role that checklists can play in easing some of our burden and some of our stress, how to make things easier that way, including, by the way, some checklists that are built into the Canvas learning management system. We don't even have to set them up. They've already done it for us. And finally, one of the things that's important when we talk about productivity is that we're being intentional. What is it that we want these approaches that we try out to do for us? What is our intent? And then how can we sort of carve these things out in our lives to be able to make best use of them? When we talk about the brain, what does it do well? What does it not do well? I want to first talk about the part of the brain you may have heard of before called the amygdala. The amygdala is in the front part of the brain, and it is sort of that fight or flight response. It's not a very sophisticated part of our brain. It's about sort of our fear response and how are we going to handle those things. A lot of people try to manage everything that's going on in their life kind of in the chaotic world of the amygdala. And it's a lot of trying to juggle, not a lot of reflection on what's actually important, but just kind of trying to respond to all the things that are coming at us. This less sophisticated part of our brain is how too many of us try to do productivity, and it doesn't work well for that. What we want to do instead, when we start thinking about using our brain well, is using it for the things that it does really, really well. And so I think often of a quote from David Allen, who wrote a book called Getting Things Done, and has really been transformative for me in my life. He says, your mind is for having ideas, not holding them. Your mind is for having ideas, not holding them. So what does that look like in our lives? Well, it means that instead of trying to hold everything up here that I need to be doing today and trying to, okay, yes, I remember I said I would get back to them, and oh yeah, I forgot about that. That's coming. I've got to prep for that class. I need to order that textbook. I have to test out that software. Instead of trying to store all of that up here in our memory, we want to get it out of our memory and into a trusted system. So we don't want to use our mind to try to hold on to everything we need to do. Instead, we want to use a set of tools that can help do that, so we can free our mind up for what it does really well, which is more on the creative element. So let's look at some tools that we can use. And sometimes when I talk about productivity, people tend to think, oh, I just need to get myself a set of tools. The more the merrier. If I could just get more tools, I would somehow be more productive. In fact, it's quite the opposite from that. I need to really hone in on the tools that were designed to help me navigate the different parts of my life and use as few of them as possible and leverage the heck out of them. So too often we're trying to get a tool to do something for us it wasn't ever designed to do and doesn't do particularly well. So let's talk a little bit about tasks, about using a calendar, and about using notes. When it comes to tasks, too often people manage tasks using tools that weren't designed to do that. So an example of that would be an email application. I'm going to just keep those emails in that inbox until I finish those things, when sometimes those things represent hours and hours, days and days, weeks and weeks, months and months of work. That's not what email was ever designed to do for us. So if I'm going to want to navigate what needs to be done, how important is it to me, and how does it relate to those roles that we talked about earlier, I'm going to need a good task manager, a to-do list. Sometimes that can be as complex as something like a project manager. Other times that can be as simple as a list in your written planner and your analog planner of things that you need to do. When it comes to our calendars, sometimes we try to make our calendar act like a task list. Oh yeah, I said I'd get back to him. Well, I'll work on that tomorrow at 10. Oh, I see I have an opening at 1 o'clock. I'll go ahead and fit that in. And we make our calendar try to behave like a task list without having those things tracked over here, so that if they don't get done today, I'm going to easily lose track of them. I'm going to go forward to the next week and I'm going to forget that last week at 10 o'clock, I said I would work on that thing. So in terms of our calendar, we mostly want it to represent time-specific commitments that we have. And of course, digital calendars work really well. There's a great calendar in Canvas even that for students and even for you can curate or collect all of the calendar due dates, class sessions, all of that across all of the classes that you teach or all of the classes your students take, and actually subscribe to them in your own calendar. The only exception to this, by the way, with a calendar is that sometimes it can be helpful to do what is called block scheduling. So my calendar would start out representing the time-specific commitments that I have, both in terms of teaching, other meetings that I have, but I also could go into my consolidated task list and I could say, oh, I need to really get on that this week. So I'm going to leave it in my task list, but I'm going to block out some time in the calendar to mirror those priorities that are in my task list. And then lastly, notes. Notes applications or some form of storing your archives, they're not necessarily actionable things like a task would be or a calendar event would be, but they support with the information we're going to need when we show up to do those tasks or when we show up to attend those meetings and those classes. So you can start to see that as we talk about these different tools, as we talk about the ways in which we might be more productive by having a minimalist set of tools that helps us navigate priorities and keep track of things, we want to have really a place to put things. As I think about my own life, my laundry situation, which I already aired to you earlier, when I think about the challenging areas that I have, it's often due, the messiness, the lack of organization is often due that things don't have a place. Now, sometimes I literally mean something doesn't have a place yet. My kids may acquire something along the way and that particular item doesn't yet have a place to store it yet in our house. But sometimes it could be an idea. I'll certainly say with COVID-19, there have been lots of things that come up where it's, should we do this? Should we try this? Oh, but what about we're going to need to take care of this? And it took a little while for me to create the kinds of systems that I needed where, that idea can go here. This can go on my task list. This is actually just reference information that I'm going to need to read. So we want to have places where we can put things away in terms of our class planning, in terms of if we're responsible for any sorts of events. It could even just be events to celebrate someone, a birthday, what have you, or it could be not managing knowledge and information that we come across. So one of the tools that I really, really enjoy, both for what it does for me in terms of productivity, but also in terms of just how fun it is to go explore, is called my someday maybe list. The idea of a someday maybe list comes from David Allen in his book, Getting Things Done, that I referenced earlier. And what he posits, and I would absolutely concur, is that if every time we have an idea of something that would be cool to do, we decide to put it on a list amongst a list of other things that we really actually ought to for sure do, not just consider, think about doing someday, that's going to get really confusing, again, for the less sophisticated parts of our minds. So having a separate place where when I come across something that I really want to check out, I don't instantly go look at it. I'm rather known for being pretty technical in my life and in my teaching. And people are like, oh, did you check out that thing yet? No, I didn't, but I put it on my someday maybe list. And then I have a regular time every 1 to 2 weeks where I can come here and say, oh yeah, I meant to try out that sketch party game. Maybe I can try out that with some friends over this weekend. Or true story, by the way, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, OBS broadcasting software. I went into this whole world I didn't even know about, how you could stream information from different video and PowerPoint and images and all this stuff and put it into one feed on the OBS broadcasting software. That could have been hours and hours I didn't have time to spend. So instead, I put it on my Sunday maybe list to come and check out. Notice it's toward the top, by the way. I did play with it a little bit yesterday because that was sort of my reward for having prepared for today's presentation. So a someday maybe list is a place where we can not try to do all the great things that we come across, but have a place later on when the time is right to sort of tap into the more creative parts of our lives and things that we want to do. I talked about email earlier. Email is a terrible task manager. Let me describe just a few reasons why. First of all, email is representative primarily of demands that other people have on you, and very rarely demands that you have on yourself for fulfilling the different roles that you play in your life. And so as it just stacks up, we keep going back and looking at it. Oh, I do need to get back on that one. Oh, that's coming up. Oh, we have our faculty gathering next week, and I said I would talk to so-and-so. And it just starts to become this snowball effect. I have talked to many academic faculty and leaders who have 7,000 plus emails in their inbox. That might be you, by the way, unread, and it just the anxiety of all the people that they haven't gotten back to, and the months and months and years that represents is a huge toll, a huge toll. So I subscribe to an approach I didn't come up with this name. Merlin Mann came up with this name in a talk he gave to Google many years ago. But what this represents, and by the way, this was about, I don't know, 5 days ago or something, is an inbox that is empty. Does that mean I have done everything I was supposed to do and taken care of every commitment to every faculty member and student that I serve? No, it doesn't. What it does mean is I have a trusted system, that task manager that I talked about before, that I forward emails to that will take more than a couple, 2-3 minutes to take care of, so that I can prioritize the action that's represented in the emails with other actions that are relevant to the roles that I play in my life. So my health is very important to me, and especially during the pandemic, for me to manage stress. It was rough there for a while, especially just trying to get used to all of the aspects of our lives that had changed. And so I really needed exercise to be up there as a priority, but no one was emailing me every day saying, make sure you exercise, make sure you exercise. So I want there to be some kind of a balance between the priorities other people have for me. By the way, they're really important to me. I'll come back to that in just a minute. And the priorities I have for myself, and that my family has for me, and that the commitments that I make to people that aren't emailing me, that I have to them as well. So I want a trusted system where I can look at those things in a more holistic way, which, by the way, means I can more likely get back to them on taking the kinds of actions that they want, versus they just eventually turn into this whole snowball of tasks. And just Back to the laundry situation, my email doesn't look like this every day. Have I been perfect at this during the pandemic? No, I haven't. But you want to know when I feel like I can most show up and have the greatest possible amount of peace in my life at this moment? It is when I know what I've committed to. And I've been able to look at it and examine and explore what's really important and have the things bubble up that are the most important for me to attend to on a given day. I have some good news for you, because I've talked about so far systems that you set up, but there are things that you can set up and keep benefiting over and over and over again every time you utilize them. And those things are as simple as a checklist. Atul Gawande is a surgeon. He's written some incredible books, and one of the amazing books he's written, I did not expect would be as interesting as it was, because it is called The Checklist Manifesto. I had no idea a book about checklists would be this interesting, but it is riveting. He goes into surgery, which is where he comes from, and the lives that have been saved through simple checklists where people go around and make sure that everybody on the team introduces each other. They talk about what the surgery is that's being performed. And they also sort of try to equalize so that everybody feels that they can speak up if anything seems awry to them. It's incredible. But he also looks at a lot of other ways that checklists are really transformative. And I'm happy to say that there are already some great checklists that you're going to be able to utilize in Canvas that I'll show you in just a minute. But let me share first this quote from Atul Gawande about checklists. He says, "Good checklists are precise and above all practical." So I've got this thing, I know every time, in my case, every time I teach a class, new semester, here's all the things I need to do. New class for a new semester, here's all the things I need to do. It's amazing how much time they save, because again, using the brain, not for holding ideas, because they're already in the checklist, but freeing me up to be able to have those ideas. Sometimes people think they don't need checklists because something's really simple. It might seem pretty simple to produce a podcast. I got to find a guest, I got to book them. There's a little online form they fill out to generate a profile, including their bio. I need to plan for the show. You can see this is starting to kind of grow. I got to send it off to the podcast editor. I got to, it gets long. Maybe we can do one of those things, but as soon as you multiply it times the number of classes you're going to teach, times the number of times you're going to repeat this, and maybe it doesn't always go start to finish. I'm often working on 3 or 4 podcast episodes at the very same time that are in differing stages of this. So checklists really help me know where I am and what needs to be done. What you're looking at over on the right is a checklist that is automatically generated for students in Canvas. They don't call it a checklist, but that's actually what it is. So you look at the top here, the to-do. For this student, these are all the different classes he or she is enrolled in. Classroom change, you've got zoology, oceanography, you've got something about the solar system up top. So consolidated across all of the classes they are taking. We've got all the assignments and things that have due dates associated with them, and the student can just go click on the item to take them to it. This is a pre-test, for example, or they can exit out if for some reason they're not going to be doing that item. They can actually mark it off there. Something I really like too down here in the bottom right is that they can get recent feedback, and in Canvas you can give them video feedback, audio feedback, written feedback, and they're going to get a little notice down there to remind them to go check that. As someone teaching in Canvas, you are not left off of the checklist bandwagon. You also have a to-do list of the things that need to be graded and how many items are left to be graded over there. And then you also have, I love this, you also have a list of upcoming date-oriented things in your classes. A lot of times I'll forget, I don't think I ever gave them the instructions or didn't ever remember to do that. So that kind of gives me a glance at what's happening. The last thing that I want to talk about in terms of productivity, we've looked at the roles that we play. We've looked at using our brain for what it's best at. We've got our set of tools. We've found places for things so that we can put them away digitally or otherwise. And then we've used checklists to be productive. None of that matters if we're not aiming for the ways in which we want to show up in those different roles. Too often when we talk about productivity, especially in academia, it's according to other people's metrics. How many journal articles did we get published? How many grants did we get achieved? Did we get accepted on? I mean, we look at, and by the way, if those things are important to you, then they're definitely important. But it's when we allow too much of our lives to be dictated by other people and not enough by intentionally thinking about what's important to us and the ways that we want to show up in all of our lives, not just in some myopic way in our lives. So we want to be intentional. And specifically, when it comes to being intentional, one important aspect to know about our emotions is that researchers have found that they're actually contagious. And that makes perfect sense to you. You think about, I was actually, of all the silliest things, I was on social media today watching the cutest little baby laughing, and I just start laughing. That kind of an interaction, and it's not even an interaction in real life, at least not in a synchronous way, just brought me to a different place. And other people that we spend time with, whether virtual or otherwise, are going to shape the ways in which we are going to be able to show up and be positive and feel good about the work that we do, that it has meaning, that it has significance. And the last chapter of my book, I quote someone named Christopher Emdin. And I just, every time I hear his words that I'm about to read to you now in terms of being intentional about where we spend our time and specifically who we spend our time with, I am once again convicted of the importance of these kinds of choices, the choices of where we spend our time. So this is from Christopher Emdin. The kind of teacher you will become is directly related to the kinds of teachers you associate with. Teaching is a profession where misery does more than just love company. It recruits, seduces, and romances it. Avoid people who are unhappy and disgruntled about the possibilities for transforming education. They are the enemy of the spirit of the teacher. I know that we don't always have complete control over who we spend our time with. And I also know that sometimes with the pandemic, the ways in which we're trying to navigate it, we can't always be quite as purposeful as we might otherwise like to be. But whether or not going to meet for coffee means literally going and sitting in a coffee shop, or whether or not going to meet for coffee means we gather this way, the way that we're gathering today, and we talk about the things that are important to us, and we challenge each other to think about ways that we can show up differently for our classes and make a real difference for our students. That's an important choice that we make on a daily basis. I have a happy story about the laundry. I feel silly telling you about the laundry, but it is symbolic because this is how our laundry room looked, at least as of last Sunday. And it didn't look that way because I folded and put away all that laundry. It looks this way because our family got together and decided that it would be important for us to have a little less stress in our lives and to kind of get this system working. And it isn't about just necessarily taking all the load on yourself, but remembering that we as teachers are a part of a group of people all around the world who are working in solidarity to try to make education better for students. And I love being a part of that community. I would encourage you to come on over to the resources page and find out ways that you could be involved in a community like that. But it's even as simple as just, setting up a Zoom session or going for a walk with a friend who also teaches, to talk about ways that we can be different. Or if it's not about teaching, if one of the things you're realizing is that you really want to be a better caregiver, if you're caring for an elderly parent, or if you two are caring for kids who are either able to go to school or not, how do we do this? We do this together. We do this as a team. And that's, to me, how we can be productive. So I am now going to pass things over to Deborah. I know she's collected some questions that you have, and perhaps even some more than we saw before the session started. So I'm going to pass it over to her to begin on that section.
All right. Well, first of all, Bonni, thank you so much for your comments or tips and tricks to productivity. My favorite was the someday maybe list. I need one of those. That's a great one.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, so we had several questions that came in ahead of time, so we'll go ahead and ask you some of those to begin. So you may have answered this, but what are some of the ways to help with overload for working from home and sharing that work-life balance effectively?
I'm going to start with the second half of the question. And I have some bad news about the second half of the question. Work-life balance? Not sure it exists. Rather than thinking about work-life balance, I encourage you to think about work-life spillover and the ways in which the things we do at work are even more than ever spilling over into the things that we do outside of work, and vice versa, the things that we do outside of work spilling over into the things that we do. Now, the good news is I got to talk to a colleague of mine who does research in this area. I talked to him for the podcast. He studies positive work-life spillover. So the ways in which the positive things we're experiencing at work can actually have a positive effect on our families, and vice versa. So it doesn't always necessarily have to be a bad thing that these things are kind of crossing over. And I loved when he said that, because it kind of freed me from thinking that I had to have it all perfectly scheduled and, things. I mean, there's more overlap than there has ever been in my life, but I think it's going to be more helpful if we frame the conversation around work-life spillover and the positive ways in which that spillover can occur, rather than trying to find the perfect balance, which for me, I have not found exists. So I do want to talk a little bit about techniques, though, for the overload part, because I think that's what the questioner asker really wants us to get to. Something that has been helpful for me, both professionally and personally, is thinking through transitions. When we first started to homeschool our children reluctantly, without this being our choice, we had to really think through when that Zoom session for them ends, what happens next, and how can we give them the tools? Remember, they're 6 and 8, so this is kind of age appropriate. You got younger kids, you're going to have a harder time. Older kids, but still, even if they're 3, thinking through transitions can be helpful, both in terms of if you have a partner, you could be talking with your partner about the transitions of that. We found it really, really helpful. I look at the next day. What am I going to need to show up? Both, I mean, in terms of showing up, being fully present for it, but also what do I need to be prepared? I need to look at that calendar. I mentioned the notes. Do I need to go through the notes and refresh myself? So thinking through transitions. And sometimes thinking through transitions means you got to take a break. So there are what are called Pomodoro timers, and you'll hear lots of different variations, whether you set a timer for 20 minutes and break for 5. I tend to like to go for 40 or 50 minutes, set a timer 40 or 50 minutes, take a brisk walk around, even if it's just around the house and I don't even get outside, but just that getting the endorphins going. So thinking through transitions, consider using the timer so you can transition yourself to a break when you need it.
All right, that was very helpful. So the second question is, how do you stay focused on outcomes with all the issues that come with online learning?
So even before I started teaching more predominantly online, I already was finding in my teaching that I really had to focus on the less is more principle. I found over and over again that when I went and revisited my learning outcomes and was able to ask myself, 5 years after this class, if I sit down and have coffee, what do I want the student not just to remember about the class, but to have actually used in some way in their lives? And if I actually do that, and I'm very disciplined about doing that, that happened way before the pandemic. But this crisis, this many of us being asked to teach in places and spaces that are unfamiliar to us, are just heightening the need for that I would argue occurred before that. So I would encourage everyone to think 5 years out. And I'm saying I've taught classes for 12 years, 15 years, the same exact class, and I still do that. I just think it's an important revisiting to get kind of minimalist about those learning outcomes. By the way, when you do that, you leave enough room for curiosity to show up. Because your students, if they're just crammed, if all you do is just, here's the 872 things I need you to know about X, what room did we leave for students to come in and have a renewed sense of curiosity about our discipline that we have long since forgotten? So honing in, leaving room for curiosity, which means some learning outcomes may show up that actually weren't on the syllabus, but they showed up because a group of us got together and got curious about something. I want to mention one specific tool, because I don't want to sound like this work is easy. It's actually some of the hardest thinking that I do. Maria Anderson, she has developed something she calls the ESIL lens. That's ESIL, it's an acronym. And basically what it lets you do is ask questions about your class. To what extent do they need to know this? She teaches math, so the examples she uses on my podcast a lot of times have to do with math, but do they have to know just that this thing exists? Or do they actually have to know how to do it step by step with paper, even if they didn't have a calculator or a spreadsheet handy? Those are the kinds of questions that help us kind of flesh out learning outcomes.
So the way I interpreted this a little bit, Bonni, is that so that's all well and good, and I spent a lot of time trying to determine what my learning outcomes are, and then I get into this online, process, and they just go out the window. I think it's how do I stay focused on those?
Yeah, for me, when I get into the online environment and work with other faculty who are doing that, it's really about minimizing your tool set. I had a colleague who discovered a, oh my gosh, what are they called? A virtual escape room. Have you heard of these before, Deborah? Yeah. So she teaches in nursing, and she's like, oh my gosh, this is great. And I'm thinking, like, for me, it goes on the someday maybe list, because I've never been to a real escape room. I don't really understand how they work. How could I possibly make that virtual? But I can save that idea for technology for if I ever become interested enough to pull it off. So I'd encourage this person and anybody who has trouble focusing, we also have to focus on the tool sets. Just because a tool exists doesn't mean that we should use it. Canvas already on its own is so full featured. I know some of you listening also teach on Blackboard. The same could be true for Blackboard. The learning management systems are already so full featured. We don't always have to go out and try to pull in a whole bunch of different tools. Use the ones that are there in more of a minimalist way, but kind of be creative in how you change up how you use them. So, but I would also say this is not easy. It's not easy. I'm glad that you're asking this question, because it means you're doing the deep kind of thinking that we should be about our teaching.
Okay. All right, the next question is, what strategies did we learn about working from home that can be translated into working in the office and classroom?
Yeah, I mentioned we have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I mentioned, boy, that was tough. I'm not sure we're out of the woods yet, by the way. I live in California, so it looks like we'll be probably returning to homeschooling, whatever that looks like. I don't literally mean homeschooling, and I don't mean to dismiss the work that the teachers are doing and preparing. It's just, it's rough, regardless of the kind of caregiver that you might be. So both for myself as a grown-up and for our kids as kids, what we like to do is think through what materials we're going to need. And I both mean materials like digital tools. So are they going to need to be, they're actually on Zoom sessions, are they going to need to be on Zoom? Are we going to need to be on Zoom? Making sure that those links work. So if I'm teaching a class, I need to be going up there and make sure that I've clicked on that link at least a day ahead of time before the students do. So I make sure that everything's working the way that it's going to need to. I'm being a little bit more proactive and looking at that next day. One technique that's been really helpful for me, because I have felt like a failure in some of this time. It's hard because you're so used to being productive, whatever that means, and then you just get slammed, oh my gosh. The big three. Thinking through, what are the three most important things I need to do today? And then if we can check off those three, I feel like there should just be some huge amount of celebration involving confetti, only virtual confetti, because I don't feel like cleaning it up after the fact. So thinking about your days and your weeks, what do I need to do to be ready for this? Kind of get a little ahead of it. And then also thinking about, for this day, big three. What are the three most important things that I need to get done? And so why do I say that, in terms of taking that from home back to the office and the classroom, a lot of those things still apply. I mean, it does go back to the learning outcomes conversation. What if you could only pick three? What would the three be? In terms of your office, if you could only get three things accomplished today, what would those three things be?
Okay. So the next question is a couple of statements together, so bear with me a little bit. So what are some specific ways we can help our students with these issues, as they will also bear more emotional and psychological load this semester? What are some signals we can watch for to see if a student is struggling with these issues, especially in this setting where we can no longer rely on the subtle cues we traditionally received in completely in-person classes?
So one of the important parts of the research around students who are able to persist in their college experiences has to do with a sense of belonging. You've probably heard that phrase before, and just how important it is that our students are able to experience that. And we need to think about the ways in which we can be even more intentional and even more not just intentional, but transparent about the ways that we're welcoming. It kind of shows up a little bit differently in a virtual environment. I want to show you a quick example of this. And so I just have to find my quick example. I can do it. Okay, I'm there. So this is a colleague. Actually, no, I'll show you mine. So some colleagues have inspired me around being more intentional about office hours. A woman named VG Sathi, she, even before the pandemic, was advocating that rather than just think about office hours as a sense of belonging, that it's just going to be you coming to see me, that's terrifying. I saw one professor when I was in college. I was in college for 4 years. You do the math here. And it was because I was failing. I did not think I was ever going to be able to pass microeconomics without showing up to Dr. Booth's office, but it was terrifying. And I don't think of myself as terrifying, but I had a student 2 years ago come to my office and say she had been forced, she could only pass, it was a student leadership class, so it wasn't student life or something like that. She could only pass her class if she interviewed one of her professors. And so she was only doing this because otherwise she couldn't pass. And I was the least worst of the fearful characters that she was going to have to show up for. So anyway, VG Sathi talks about being more inclusive in terms of office hours. What if our office hours looked different and we could have sort of a group study session? In her case, what if she went to the eatery, the cafeteria area, and met the students where they feel most comfortable? Now, it's going to be harder to do that in a virtual environment, but not impossible. So let me show you what inspiration I took from some of my colleagues around a virtual office hours. So if you ever came and visited me here at my institution and came to my physical office, it kind of looks like this. I've got a bookshelf, I've got a whiteboard, I've got 2 chairs instead of a couch, but they're that same shade. And so these items are clickable, where I can click and go read, see what books I'm reading. So maybe the students might connect that way. My last name is pretty hard to pronounce, so I could click here and go to name coach, the website where you can record your name being pronounced. I could click over here and go to my Twitter account, or if I want to schedule office hours virtually, I could do that here as well. And it is a class about productivity, by the way, so I can click on these productivity tools and be linked over to a page that I linked on your same page for today's talk. So that's just one way to think about being more welcoming, because we're not going to maybe get the same cues that this question asker is writing about. So I want to start with this sense of belonging, creating that sense of welcome, and office hours, or whatever that looks like for you, group study sessions, whatever it looks like. We also need to normalize help-seeking behaviors. When my husband was in college, he suffered with depression, and he's often shared that story with my students so that they can feel empowered that, it's that same thing. If you broke your arm, you'd go to the doctor. But a lot of times, the students that I work with, there really is still a lot of stigma among their families around going to get the help they need. So we want to normalize those help-seeking behaviors. Sometimes that can be, it depends on your personality and your situation, but maybe it's sharing a personal story. Maybe it's just making sure that the information about getting to your counseling centers is very prominent in your Canvas course shell. And also thinking about engagement, measures of your students engaging in the class, less as surveillance. I'm going to catch you because you haven't checked in on class for 2 weeks, rather than me catching you as a bad thing. I want to catch you so I can make sure that you're okay and check in on you. In the Canvas gradebook, there is a wonderful feature that's really easy to use. If you just hover your mouse above any of the assignments, and you click on the little drop down, there's a feature called Message Students Who. So I can say message students who scored less than a 70% on the last exam. I can say message students who didn't turn anything in for this assignment. So being a little bit more proactive, instead of in a punitive way, but in a way where I can reach out and say, I'm here for you. Is there anything that I can do to help you? And I will also just share real quick before we go to the next question. This can actually have really good results, where it actually looks like, from a student's point of view, that you literally just emailed them. Because it comes to them just as they're the only person that got it, depending on how you worded it. So I actually felt guilty the first time I tried it, because I heard back from like 80% of the students. I said, this message is going out. It looks like you had some trouble on the test. Could we get together this coming week and let's talk about strategies? And they all were just right there feeling like, wow, my professor cared about me, is reaching out and helping me feel safer to get the help that I need to do better in this class.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Can we make sure we are not overloading students with content and tasks in Canvas?
I mentioned Maria Anderson, the math faculty member, among other things. I'm oversimplifying the work she does for the sake of time. She has another technique that I really like here. She follows the same cadence throughout her entire math class. Every module or every week has the 3 same things: learn, explore, and apply. So when it comes to learning, she does make use of some quizzing. She also makes use of what are called guided note-taking tools. So they download her template and it kind of guides her through the kinds of notes that she wants them to take. I love the explore that she does. I always wish my math professors would have used this, although she reminds me there was not the access to data when I went to school that there is today. It's phenomenal, but she has them go to graphs of the world. And she has, it's just hundreds and thousands of graphs. She has them find a graph that resonates with them for some reason that applies to the mathematical principle or calculation that she is trying to teach. So she's mapping what they're learning by exploring, though. Rather than, let me keep you here inside this learning management system, let me send you out into the web to a whole bunch of things that you can find something that's particularly interesting, but that maps back to what we're learning. And then the apply, isn't that what we all want to do in our learning? How does this apply to me? And so she has some way where, rather than just rote tests that it's hard to see how this relates to me, she really has them apply it in some meaningful and significant way. For me, once I've set that up, that cadence, even if I don't have it all figured out before the term starts, let's say hypothetically that were ever to happen, I have the holders for it. Every week we're going to do this, and it feels that much more manageable. Now, you might have some major projects that are in there and some other things that you're doing, but just that cadence of kind of every week's going to have some similar flavor to it can really reduce that workload and get us real about what's actually realistic to expect of them as well. There's also a workload calculator from Rice University's workload calculator. Every time I go up there and I put in the reading that I'm assigning to my students, I've always underestimated how long it's going to take, because it's not just the number of pages, but it's how familiar am I with the content and the reading level of the content. So there's really 3 factors that go into how long something's going to take to read on average. And then we got to kind of grow that a little bit and get real a little bit as well.
Thank you so much, Bonni. This has been very helpful, and your continuous, answering the questions contributed to your presentation. And now Jocelyn's here to take over.
Thank you, Bonni. And thank you, Deborah, for moderating. Those are fantastic questions. We again want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Big Splash, especially which Deborah is here, and the director of the Center for Teaching Excellence, Disability Resources, Provost Communications, Provost IT Office, TTVN for the live stream, as well as Canvas and LinkedIn Learning, who have all been tremendous partners to help us bring this event to fruition. We also want to thank our LMS Advisory Committee members who are providing just a tremendous amount of effort and thought as we transition to Canvas over the next year. We will be sending out an email in the next couple of days that'll have a survey, and we would love your feedback to be able to continue to innovate our programming and our resources. And I have to say, Bonni, I don't think I do any of what you recommend, so work cut out for me as well. So this was a really fun session to be able to take away some very practical tips. So thank you both. And with that, we will sign off.